You are listening to Seeking the Hidden Thing with Kryptos. Welcome to another episode of Seeking the Hidden Thing podcast. It's my distinct pleasure to have on Brandon Zaffini. And this is a conversation that's maybe 10 months to a year in the making. Brandon is a professor. He teaches, and that makes for a very busy schedule while school is on. But school is over now. And so he had some thoughts about a conversation that I had with Nate Fischer about technology and our ability to sustain technological sophistication and even what you might say technological process or progress without scale. Like, what happens when you descale a society? Can you sustain the same level of prosperity, technological side? So we finally have a chance to have this discussion. So welcome, Brandon.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. Hopefully it's a good discussion.
Well, I hope so. I think it will be. It's a fascinating subject. So Nate's originally, then we'll try to be very fair to him, in part because this is what Nate does, is that with new founding, his work as a venture capitalist is to try to fund technological ventures. And some of these technological ventures are built around allowing people to build communities without necessarily, having to be plugged into the regime. So what are the kind of technologies and so forth you might need to build smaller interlaced communities that aren't dependent upon the larger infrastructure of, the global American empire kind of thing, right? So these types of things. How do you build resistant? So if a Christian community wanted to live parallel to and separate from, but within the larger, Western sphere, could they do that without necessarily being dependent upon that larger sphere? And Nate, and he's put a fair stake in this, he believes this is possible. And he, and on a number of measures, he argues that, okay, sometimes what we think of as quality of life really isn't quality of life. And if you scale down society, things would change, yes, and maybe prosperity change, but it would also open up vistas of maybe a better quality of life that's different. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to let go of being a technological people. And you had some thoughts on that, and I think on the whole, I think there's something to that, but I think in the end, I probably disagree.
Well, it certainly sounds too good to be true.
Yes.
So I'll give you that. It's a lot easier, I think, to take the skeptical ground in this debate. Not that I don't appreciate your position. I do. I sympathize with it in many ways. I should say right off the bat that I really appreciate Nate's project. I wish him well. I'm not going to make here a prediction about whether it succeeds, because to me, that's a different
Yes.
question altogether. What's going to happen in the future? That's not a business that I want to get into. I'm not a prophet or son of a prophet, so I'm not going to be making any prediction. In fact, if I was a betting man, I'd probably with you be taking the more pessimistic line. But having said that, I think I largely agree with his position that it is possible. And I think that focusing on technology it's an important factor. I think where I would like to qualify or maybe add to his position a little bit is by emphasizing the role of systems. And I really take your critique as focusing on systems. So if I remember the conversation correctly, and it's been a little bit, like you said, it's been 10 or so months or something.
Yeah, we'll link to it in the show notes so you have it. Yeah.
Right. You can let me know if I'm mischaracterizing it.
Sure.
But the way I understood the conversation, Nate was focusing on different technologies, technological ventures that have taken place. I think he mentioned E.F. Schumacher, who's very renowned in communitarian circles for his Small is Beautiful book. And E.F. Schumacher and the economists who follow him did, in fact, implement various what they called intermediate technologies. And they did this especially in a developing context. So around the world, in nations and regions that were still developing. So it has been done on a small scale, nothing extraordinary. Like I don't think we can point to any one area and say, oh, it was utterly transformative and it proved that that we can have it all or something. Nothing along those lines. But we do see some modest successes. And again, I take his venture as trying to lean into those kinds of technological projects here in the United States. So I appreciate that. I think, however, focusing on discrete technologies, first and foremost, is probably a mistake. I think those of us who are interested in this kind of positive project need to take your systemic critique seriously and think about the possibility of different kinds of systems. So that's really how I want to approach this. The way I see your position shaking out, and again, tell me if I have it wrong, but the way I see it is you would lean toward the view that we either accept all the ills that you describe on your blog and podcast, all the technocratic features that are impersonal and bureaucratic and that result in mass propaganda systems and over managerialism and all those factors that you describe so ably all the time. We either accept that and technological progress, or we give up on technological progress and we accept civilizational decline. Maybe we need to go back to the Dark Ages or something, but we're really stuck between those two polarities. Do I have your position right?
Yeah, mostly. So I think it's built out of Ellul's idea of, and it's funny. It's almost, I mean, Ellul being, broadly speaking, like a continental Calvinist, has an Augustinian understanding of the universe, right? That, in a sense, and which he applies to technology. So he argues basically that every technology has a kind of telos or its own particular meaning. And he says technology really doesn't care. So when you introduce a technology or a technical system, technique, that it always brings both positives and negatives. And generally, when you look at it, the positives tend to be front loaded, and oftentimes the negatives come downstream after the positive gains have been realized, and then the effects are kind of wearing off and you've plateaued or whatever. And then all of a sudden the negatives begin to crop up. So the basic argument is, and that's sort of the key to ambivalence, is that this both good and evil come together. He argues that, when you try to solve one level of technical problems with new technology, he says you just complexify the problem. So it begins to become more, the problems begin to magnify on orders of scale. So you get that, the upward curve. And so then the question comes then, I think a lot of people argue that, well, if we just eliminate the negatives, then everything will be good. And I think what Ellul would argue is that you can't both fix the technological system and keep it. So in a certain sense, you have to recognize now, and in many ways, technology is like a kind of, it's like taking a bite of the apple in the garden. So once you know about technical systems, it's very hard to unknow them. So the power that they give, the ability to harness power and money, remain out there as a temptation. So it becomes a kind of fact that you have to deal with, so that as soon as somebody wants to harness power and money at scale, they're going to come to these kind of systems sooner or later in a development cycle, and especially since the knowledge of them is out there anyways. So there's this idea, it is almost that we're going to continue going forward the way we're going. Even forward is that's part of the whole propaganda of human progress. We're going to keep going on the same track that we're going until we can go no farther, and it kind of falls apart, and then we'll pick up the pieces after that. Because in a sense, the circumstances won't allow us the kind of tech to produce the same level of technological sophistication that we have now. So either we run out of energy, or we can no longer sustain easily the scale. Like, take, for example, say the global American empire crumbles, and Americans are no longer around to protect the sea lanes, and now you can no longer ship rare earth metals from China safely because you have to deal with pirates, and so you have to find new ways of doing it. And because you don't have rare earth metals, you then now can't have cell phones, and then you can see sort of this cascading failure, and then you'll reach a point where the technological systems will be sustainable at the scale that you're currently living at. And I guess that's the fundamental sort of core of the argument, that once the scale recedes, then the level of technological sophistication will balance itself out to match the level of scale.
Right. So I think that that's a very powerful critique, and especially when levied against Nate's position, because I think it pushes very strongly against this idea that you can somehow implement piecemeal reforms, just kind of tinker around the edges, introduce a new technology here, a new technology there, and suddenly everything's good. And we managed to keep our current state of our current wealth and standard of living. That's probably not the case. We're probably going to have to do something more substantive, something that affects the system as a whole. So I would agree with that. I'm going to be arguing that itself is possible, though it's not going to seem like it's possible, because we're like fish who are in water. We know what it means to be wet, but we can't imagine what it's like not to be wet. And we're so enmeshed in this current system that imagining a different system counterfactually, it's very, very difficult to do. So
it is.
So in that respect, I think you're right. I think that piecemeal reforms are not going to work. I think that just trying to make the system we have work better or more efficiently, whatever that means, given its large scale, given its overall propensities toward a certain type of standardized product at a certain scale, that's probably not going to work. I would also say part of the difficulty of even having this discussion and thinking larger than that is because we've largely adopted a certain, especially like classically liberal framing about how economies work. And what I mean by this is we have depoliticized the marketplace probably more than we should. Now, there are good reasons why we've done that. I mean, there was a time early in the 20th century where we didn't understand what we understand today, that a market in its essence is it's comprised of individual actors who are transacting on a somewhat voluntary and spontaneous basis. And that means we can't have a top-down economy where we're equalizing all the outcomes, or trying to set prices or whatever the case may be. And so because of that, because we've understood that lesson, we've really absorbed it as modern people, I think what we've done in the process is we've lost sight of the political characteristics of the marketplace, the sense in which we have formed the marketplace to function and operate in a certain manner. And I think we have more political tools that we can operate without trying to repeat a Soviet-like experiment where we are controlling the economy in a top-down manner. But that would be the case I want to try to make. So I want to focus, if I can, on. So if we're going to focus on technologies for a little bit, I think we have to remember that every discrete technology we use operates in a certain infrastructure context. And we can think of infrastructures in various ways. You can think of infrastructure in terms of material infrastructure. You can think of infrastructure in terms of legal infrastructure, financial infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. And all these are mutually reinforcing. When one of them has a certain drift or orientation, many of the others will have a similar drift or orientation. Now, when I'm talking about infrastructure, I'm really talking about, in this case, the organizing principles of a system. And so if I can, I want to think a little bit for just a brief moment about what we mean by system, because we throw out words like system all the time. And when Ellul talks about system, when Weber talks about system, I would argue what they have in mind is one kind of system, but we can think of systems more broadly than they normally do. So maybe this is a point of contention between you and me. We'll see. I'll
Sure.
make the case and then I'll let you respond if that works. So when some of these really important 20th century sociologists think about system, they always think of a large scale system, always. And they associate it with a certain rationalizing technique, with bureaucracy, with impersonality, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Now, okay, that is how the systems in which we're implicated every day. That is how they look. That's an apt description of the kinds of systems we experience on a day-to-day basis. But a system, more fundamentally, is really just, defining it in a non-technical manner. We can say a system is the rules of the game. Okay, it's the organizing principles that structure interactions between the agents who inhabit them. Okay, so there are systems take different varying levels of complexity and varying levels of scale. So if we think of the rules of a game, sometimes they develop spontaneously, though not always. We could think as an example of children on a play set running around, and at first they're just chaotically running around. They have really no idea what they're doing. But then 5 minutes later, rules have developed almost spontaneously as a result of their interactions. And as they policed and self-regulated themselves, now they've created rules, and now a system has developed because it's the organizing principle that's structuring what was initially their chaotic play. Okay, so rules at the most basic level, systems can initially develop spontaneously. And often when we think about market systems, we think of in their earliest origin days as often developing spontaneously, right? We can think of a barter system where people are bartering, and then money gets introduced, and then property gets defined, and all of a sudden you have these legal rules and these certain norms that develop around how people transact economically. Okay, so systems may start spontaneously. They don't have to, obviously. I could go and often have with my own kids, I could organize a game, impose the rules from the start, and they begin to play. But the point I'm trying to make is systems it's really a game. And I mean, it's a game in the sense that there's a winner and a loser, or at least there's people who succeed and flourish, and those who, if they didn't lose, at least they're less successful. Every system has that orientation. It rewards certain sets of behaviors and certain sets of actions, and it implicitly, at least, penalizes other types of actions. Okay?
Yes.
So when we're talking about a large-scale system, I think the assumption is every system, by its nature, rewards large, abstract economic actors who pursue quantitative reforms and ends over qualitative, who engage in very risky behavior and grow very, very large, and eventually become, in the economic parlance of today, too big to fail. And then we have to introduce more rules to try to make them, in Taleb's words, more anti-fragile, and that's very difficult because these large scale entities. We assume that systems always reward that type of behavior. But we know, even, historically, that not all markets have rewarded that type of behavior. Some markets have rewarded growth, but growth that wasn't strictly and only quantitative. Growth that was also qualitative. Growth that was more regionally focused rather than more nationally or globally focused. And so there are organizing principles to the game that reward certain types of behavior and penalize various others. And if we think of another example, it might be helpful here. If we think of a board game, when you are creating a board game, from what I understand, there's a major renaissance in board game innovation and creation right now. There's lots of new board games coming out all the time.
You're not a board game geek then, I assume, right?
What's that?
You're not a board game geek then, I assume.
I guess I'm not a geek. I don't mind playing the board games, but
we are a bit of board game geeks. I have a whole closet full of board games here, so yeah.
Yeah, there's new ones.
I get what you're saying, though. Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
So a board game has rules, it has codes, and then there's a physical layout. We could say infrastructure to
even a logic to it.
Yeah, there's a logic to it. There are technologies, or at least pieces, that are appropriate to one kind of game that wouldn't be appropriate in another kind of game. And if you are a board game player, if you've played a lot of different games, that different games motivate you. They incentivize you to behave and act in very different ways. Some games actually.
Some people are better suited to some games than others as well too. And right. Some people, like from the way they're wired, some games merit logical decision making, very careful. Other games require like intuitive leaps. And, some games require, it comes down to making 20 discrete decisions that all have to be maximized for their benefit, right? Relative to what other people are doing, right? So there's all these different types and then they can be categorized into categories of rule systems. And then there's always the whole thing of, the quote unquote broken meta, where you basically, once you've pretty much figured out a game where there's only one path to victory and whoever can get on that path the quickest and it will always win, right? And then the game is just unplayable at that point, right? So you like games that have multiple paths to victory where you can't necessarily game. There's always something to do to counter the move of somebody else, these types of things.
Yeah. So part of what's being incentivized is not merely the behavior of the players, but also the types of technologies we're interested in creating in the first place. So if the type of organizational structure that you are in encourages large scale creation over more regionally focused, regionally based creation, then you're going to be more interested in creating like a telephone, for example, because telephones benefit from network effects, right? They benefit from large scale, from the more people you have as a member of your telephone network, the more useful it is. Now, I have nothing against the internet or telephone, these certain communication devices that now we're just
using it right now.
Yeah, that we're using right now. I have nothing against them necessarily. My point, though, is in order for you to come up with to introduce what Schumacher calls intermediate technologies, you can introduce them piecemeal. But unless you're also thinking about the system as a whole, first of all, the technologies you introduce aren't going to be that useful. Because if the system as a whole has a certain orientation, introducing technologies that are about localized community economic development, it'll be nice, it'll be cool for the 2 or 3 people who are into that. And then everyone else who is playing a different game, because it makes sense in the large scale system we have to play the game they're playing, it's not going to catch on. So back to my earlier point about Schumacher's idea, it caught on in developing nations, in developing regions, because they hadn't gone through all the stages of industrial and technological development that we have. And so in those kinds of contexts, they didn't already have these large scale enmeshed systems. In that context, it's like, hey, we'll introduce a new plow device that's good for this indigenous people group that doesn't have the industrialized systems that we have in the West. And yeah, it caught on and it was useful for a period. Though I'm not actually sure the long-term attractiveness of even those technologies once these developing nations end up importing the types of systems that we have here. But my simple point is technologies is not enough. And here's, I think, again, your criticism is a really fair one. Technologies by themselves are no real panacea. They're no solution if the orientation of the system is what it is. And so I agree, we need to think more about different kinds of systems. Now, here's where my argument immediately runs into a roadblock, because as I said earlier, I have the problem of counterfactuals. How do I prove that another type of system is in fact possible? So I have a couple examples.
Sure.
I'll let you break in a second, but I would like to give a couple examples of system reforms, system innovations that were played around with in the 19th century that show that it is in fact possible. And I'm going to focus on some legal systems and then actual tangible infrastructure systems. Maybe before I do that, I'll pause because it seemed like you had something you wanted to say.
Well, I may hold on that. I think in some sense I tend to agree with you, because I think the argument for parallelism runs a sense of that you're doing things alongside of, but within. So you're not side by side, but you're doing things inside of this larger system. So the question is how can you create the space to do something different?
Right.
And Ellul talks about the two factors. So you have to be able to uncouple yourself from both the rewards and the punishments of the regime. So if we go back a few years to a book by Rod Dreher, right, the Benedict option, you set up parallel communities and you run these on a different set of values and so forth. What level of scale could you accomplish? One doesn't really know. But, there's examples of this kind of thing in the Mennonite community. But as soon as you bore into something like the Mennonite community, you realize that the Mennonite community is still dependent upon the violence that America can wield, or, Canada, wherever you find these Mennonite communities. They're dependent upon the protection and the goodwill of the American empire to protect them and their parallel option. That if they had to exist on yourself, you come back to always the violence problem. And so this is, and I've talked about this with Ernst van Zyl in South Africa, and for their thing, and they talk there about what's called the porcupine decision, how the porcupine can keep himself away from the leopard, even though the porcupine is in theory not nearly as tough as the leopard. He just makes himself very, very difficult and unpalatable. It's just too much. It's too painful to actually, hunt and eat a porcupine for a leopard. So they move on. And that's kind of, he says, you want to sort of put yourself in a position that way. So in my mind, in theory, at least, you could picture a sense where you have a small community that can uncouple itself from the rewards, but also the punishments by being able to wield violence. But then you become like a separate state within a state, and then you're dealing sort of with negotiating, because you almost in a sense have to trade, because you can't be completely, maybe you can be like an autarky, but very few communities can ever be autarky. So then you're in a sense of being a nation within a nation that's able to trade with the larger nation and be able to set your own terms for existence. And that would be kind of, for me, how I would conceive it. But then what would that look like from a technological point of view? Do you have to match the same level of technological sophistication? So then are you just basically becoming your enemy in order to free yourself from your enemy? And these are kind of, I think, some of the questions that emerge. So that was sort of my thoughts. And then maybe I'll let you then sort of flesh out what you were thinking in terms of these intermediaries, some of these examples of intermediary systems that have worked.
Yeah, that was a good comment. Before I do that, I want to respond to your comment there.
Sure.
I mean, speaking from a U.S. context here, we have a term to describe that, and it's called federalism, right?
Yeah.
And
in theory, right? Yeah.
Right, in theory, right? And this is important. So whenever anybody brings up political federalism, then
they go, well, there was this war in the middle of the 1800s that kind of decided that once and for all, right?
Right. Everyone's like, oh, it doesn't work. 1860 through 1865 decisively proved that that's a dead horse, and we can't go back to that. Well, okay, I take that argument seriously. There is something to that. I think, here, I'll say this: American federalism at its best was always a little bit of a compromise system, right? Because you had a national security element, like in some sense, it's the American nation, and we're securing our interests as a nation. This was fundamental to Alexander Hamilton's argument in the Federalist Papers. He said, this is exactly why we need a union between these ostensibly independent states. So, okay, on one sense, we're thinking of ourselves in a nationalist way. In another sense, the states have their own militia. You get the sense that you don't even get the sense. You saw it in action in the middle of the 19th century when one block of states sought to impose its will on another. They're like, okay, come enforce your will, and we're gonna prosecute it out in the battlefield. Now, what's really interesting
their industrial capacity really won that war. It was,
absolutely.
In some sense, the South had, other than maybe the issue of slavery, sort of had the spiritual question, quote unquote, on their side. They were fighting for their culture, but in that sense, industry and technique won out in the end.
Yes, exactly. And so here would be my point to this. I mean, the reason I think that appealing to American federalism today seems kind of ridiculous is because the states aren't even functioning like their own regional economic blocks or entities. Right?
No,
at least you
anymore.
had that during the American Civil War. Now, the problem was, as you're rightly pointing out, there was a kind of productivity disparity between the North and the South. And the war, it lasted long enough that the North was able to capitalize off that, especially in tandem with the naval blockade that they were able to impose. Yes. So, okay, that's true. When you have disparities, economic disparities between different regions, that's a problem. But today we don't even have that minimal condition, right? There is no separate regional economic bloc that isn't enmeshed with the larger system. And so that's why I think this is a useful conversation to have in the first place. If you believe in the value of American federalism, maybe not in the abstract or maybe not universally, I guess that's a different conversation, but at least here in the United States, it is a central, I would argue, a central element of the American political tradition. So if you believe that and you believe that it's something worth thinking about or striving for on some level, you have to focus on the economic preconditions of you can't have political independence to any degree if you don't have some kind of economic self-sufficiency that supports whatever political power you think you have. So yeah, I think a lot rides on, I guess I would reverse the argument a little bit and say here's what I hear you saying. Let me back up. Here's what I hear you saying. Sure. You're saying we can't have self-sufficient economic regional blocks because we don't have any degree of political independence anymore. But I actually see the causal relationship reversed here. I would say the reason we're struggling to double down on American federalism is because we've lost the economic preconditions. And so I think maybe the economic self-sufficiency is a primary and necessary condition to pursue federalism in a political sense, if that makes sense.
So that your ability to wield political power rests on your ability to maintain the economic integrity of your state, your society, your system in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of this in a global context right now. Part of the reason that Trump and the MAGA movement is so popular is because increasingly the U.S. economy is dependent on other states. We're dependent on China, and we're dependent on a whole host of states globally. We have these long supply chains and so forth. And so this dependency makes us vulnerable. Now, obviously, there's always going to be trade. There's always going to be comity between different regions, economic regions, political blocks, whatever the case may be. There's always going to be comity and trade between them. But when it reaches such a high level that you're now entirely enmeshed with one another and there's dependency or even codependency, well, it becomes very hard to hold on to at the national level. Even it becomes very hard to hold on to your decision-making autonomy,
political sovereignty.
Your political sovereignty. The EU is a classic example of this, but we're seeing this all across the world, and this is a major impetus behind Trump's rise. So I'm saying if that's true at the national level, it's also true at the regional level as well. And I think that we've been insufficiently attentive to these economic preconditions. So if I'm wrong, if you can't create a system that's more focused on the region itself, then there are unfortunate political consequences of that as well. And I think, again, that may be your framing of it. Your framing may be we have to go back to the dark ages. Because we're gonna end up with a feudal system, we have to end up with a feudal system across the board, economically and politically.
Well, there is a sense, I think, where adaptations can come about, but I think in some way you're correct that what frustrates people in today's political context is that because of the global nature of the integrated economic systems, however they came about, corporations pursuing their interests separate from the interests of a people group, as distinct entities in that regard, that it is, I think, worthwhile to question the degree of political sovereignty that countries wield in that regard. So is their sovereignty more imagined than real? Like, can you break apart the system? Now, like you say, global trade is always going to happen. In the past, they dealt with that through very lumpy supply chains. So you maintain warehouses full of parts to go into various products that you were assembling because you couldn't necessarily rely on them being delivered. But now that you have just-in-time delivery systems, you can empty all those warehouses, but it's dependent upon the interrelated trade, logistics systems that straddle the globe, so that the day that a part has to go onto the car, it's arriving at the loading docks. These are tremendously complex systems, but I think there is a level of political decoupling that can happen, that can be accommodated for. And the question is how far down that level of decoupling can you go before it begins to significantly impact people's material standard of living? Not necessarily like what Nate was telling, your qualitative standard of living, but your material standard of living. Is there a point? And I would argue, I think there probably is a point of decoupling that it does begin to negatively impact your ability to sustain a certain level of material standard of living. Not to say you're all going to be living poor, but yeah.
In part, it depends on what you mean by decoupling. So sticking with for a moment with the international example, we tend to think of decoupling in terms of the stick of tariffs, right? We're going to impose higher trade barriers of various forms, and that'll decouple us. Well, that's fine. That makes it more difficult. That's going to increase transaction costs. It's going to make it more difficult for us to conduct international business. But what you're going to do in that case is you're going to dampen economic productivity. So unless it's married to systemic reforms that are incentivizing more nationally based productivity, then you're only going to feel the cost, and you're not going to experience any associated benefit along the way. So that's where, like, it's not enough to destroy an existing system or to decouple it, to introduce some barriers to its smooth and efficient functioning. That's one thing you can do, but it can't be the only thing you do. So focusing on tariffs, for example, as an isolated solution, that too, I think, is a dead end.
Yeah, and then there's part of the problem comes down to as well too with, say, something like rare earth metals. One of the things that America's enjoyed the benefit of is they've passed off some of the environmental costs of mining these rare earth metals to places that are outside of the United States that are not nearly as scrupulous. So they pass it off to Africa and to China. Mm-hmm. From what I understand, there's fairly significant supplies of rare earth metals in the United States on its native soil, but to extract those comes with a high environmental cost. There's just no way around it, right? So there's all of these then trade-offs that you begin to have to face that right now maybe you're not facing, because the true cost of these goods are not being borne fully by the people that are enjoying the benefits from them.
Yeah, there are trade-offs. I think my argument would be there's trade-offs either way. And the path we've taken disguises some of those trade-offs. So by adopting a large-scale system, we have the too big to fail phenomenon, where it kind of has this Ponzi scheme feel to it. It tends to take resources and centralize them, right? So some people do very, very well, but the benefits aren't distributed. I'm not going to say evenly, but they're not distributed in a way like they kind of have this parasitic relationship with certain segments of the economy or certain regions. Even you even see this geographically in the United States, where we talk now about flyover country. You've got all these flyover regions, and whatever economic productivity occurs there, much of it is destined to end up in some of our megalopolises on the coast. And that's really the heart of everything. Those are the centralized hubs of economic productivity. And now you're seeing the same thing happen globally as well. So those systems are very, very risky. And I would argue that we even saw that very, very early in the 19th century as these systems began to take shape. So one example I would give is, I like this example because it's simple, it's clear. and it's more intuitive because it deals with physical infrastructure. But it's really interesting that if you study the debates over the intercontinental train systems that were constructed in the 19th century, there were different models that were experimented with, and there were trade-offs or costs with all of them. And the model we ended up adopting was really no better or more productive over the long term than the system that was rejected. And it was largely rejected for political reasons. So a great book, I'm going to recommend a book on this, a great book that very few people have heard about. It was written by a political scientist named Gerald Burke. I think it came out of his dissertation research, but the title of the book is Alternative Tracks. And when these train tracks were being built, one of the models that was experimented, it was also experimented initially in Chicago and Midwestern region more generally, but it was constructed in what Burke calls a maple leaf form. So you had a central trunk line of tracks, but then you had lots of lesser tracks branching off the major track and feeding the entire Midwestern region in and around Chicago. Mm-hmm. Now, there was some complexity with building a train system like this, because if you're going to serve within a region, you're going to be shipping goods that are heterogeneous, right? Different mm-hmm. kinds of cargo. It's not going to be one bulk cargo. So that means it's going to be more difficult to calculate. You're going to need people located along different stretches of the tracks who are making quick decisions about what to load and how much to charge for them so they can serve the needs of the region. Okay. Mm-hmm. But this train track ended up being very, very successful. It didn't grow quite as quickly, but the growth it did have was substantial, and it was far less risky, because when you're serving the dynamic economic needs of a region, you're not dependent on like 1, 2, or 3 major producers. Mm-hmm. Basically, everyone who's doing business and producing and selling in that region is able
sending
to
it all back and forth on these trains.
That's right. They're sending it back and forth on the trains. Now that was one model that developed. And again, it was very successful. Its growth was modest, but very substantial. And notably, before I move on and talk about the second model, notably, it incentivized, it encouraged decentralized management and control, right? Because you can't have centralized management and control if you have all kinds of different kinds of cargo. Like, you need on the ground decision making. The second model you can kind of think of, instead of a maple leaf form, it was like one big centipede. All right. It was one major trunk line and then these very short feeders. So rather than actually serving the dynamic needs of a self-contained region, it's more traversing through the region, and it's moving large quantities of the same bulk of cargo from one place to the next. Now, over vast differences. So this is going to favor very, very large companies and very, very large corporations who are selling one kind of product or only a small number of products, and they're moving them, to major centralized hubs. Now, initially, this long haul train model was less successful. Many of them started going bankrupt. And what happened is, because they're dependent on only a few companies, so it makes sense. It's a much riskier model. When they went bankrupt and they went to court and there was arbitration, receivership, invariably the government bailed them out. And so in doing that, and there were different reasons for this. It often fit the ideological and economic interests of the judges these cases were largely tried in federal courts because these trains traversed across the entire country. So it didn't make sense to have local courts deal with it. And federal courts had the judges sitting on the bench had a certain ideological disposition that lent themselves to large scale systems. So they encouraged the government to bail out these trains that had gone bankrupt under the argument that we're now also familiar with, that these these transportation systems were too big to fail. What that did was that sent a signal to those still building trains that, yes, the downside of this model is it's very risky, but we don't have to worry about that risk anymore because the government's going to come in and it's going to bail us out.
Yes.
So more and more of the long haul trains were built, and they were able to manipulate rates. So a lot of these trains would cluster together and they would create their own rate pools, as they called them, where they would set rates for different regions. And they were able to create rates eventually that privileged their large scale systems over their regional counterparts. So what they did, for example, was they insisted that rates for cargo that was traveling through these regions rather than traveling in and among these different regions could be set at lower rates. And so they were supply and demand. They were more attractive to use for many businessmen who might be willing to use either train system simply because the rates were lower. And so eventually, by the beginning of the 20th century, the other model of train system deteriorated. Now, this was a conscious political decision to support one kind of infrastructure system that then has cascading effects on everything else, right? Because if now the transportation system I have is encouraging me to engage in large scale operation, well, it makes sense for me to change the way I do business. It makes sense to change what technologies I'm interested in, what kind of things I'm interested in producing. I'm not interested in producing a wide variety of things, but rather I just need to think about scale. How much can I produce since I'm producing for consumer base that is vast, right? In some ways,
yeah, you're creating the markets as you go along. So the regional market is dissolved in favor of the mass market. So you only have to produce one or two types of goods that then can service this mass market. And that enables you to, so the scaling up economically occurs as you're scaling up politically, and the two work hand in hand to accumulate wealth and power as things are scaled up, and you undermine these local sort of regional based solutions.
Yeah, what's interesting is I forget his name. I think it was like Stickney or something. But the owner of the Great Western Chicago train that adopted the other model, the owner called himself very intentionally a regional Republican. And he tried to make, in addition to making an economic argument, which by the way I think there was a congressional report that verified that his economic case, where he's basically saying that rates are being manipulated in a way that makes it seem like these other systems are more competitive when they're really not. It was examined by third parties, and they did conclude that his economic argument was sound. But be that as it may, he also tried to make it a political and ideological argument. He said, look, these regions can't be self-supporting politically. And think of what that means in terms of the freedom of communities and individuals within these different communities if they're all beholden on this vast system. So he very self-consciously adopted this regional Republican stance and said, my system is actually more consistent with the political ideals of this country. Now, what's interesting is in both cases, it was going to be a political decision, right? When we construct infrastructure, this is a classic thing that the governments have always been involved in to varying degrees. Certainly there are private actors that are involved with them as well. It's in the nebulous area of like public-private partnerships, as we would call them today. But the point is the government is involved, and it's going to privilege one kind of system over the other. Now, my argument is, what's interesting about this case is it shows that it is possible to have growth, to have material benefits. Maybe you're not growing quite as rapidly. But even saying that, I think we need to qualify it somewhat, because how do we assess and evaluate rapid growth? I mean, I think Nate made this point. GDP is a very rough measurement of growth because there's a lot of things that GDP is not factoring into its analysis. So you could make an argument that this growth model, it provides more organic growth. You're going to see more variety. You're going to see more local decision making. It's going to be more decentralized because the system encourages. Again, the rules of the game are different. It encourages, it motivates that behavior. So my argument would be That's basically what we need to do if we want to promote local economic development. We can talk about technologies till we're blue in the face, but if we're not thinking more carefully and deliberately about the supporting infrastructure systems and
Yes.
how they're motivating certain activity, nothing else we do really matters. Now, that's going to be difficult because we're now downstream of the interstate highway system, and which was itself.
Yeah, exactly. And this is another thing, because it was, as you were talking about this rail system, I was reminded of the debate over, the walkable versus, drivable city type of thing, right? And so what makes cities more, or towns more walkable is you create, I take the example, say the Netherlands, and now it's a geographical thing as well too, though. But, you have a series of towns that are between 5,000 and 10,000 people, and they're all within, say, a half-hour bike ride of each other. And they're like a web of all of these little towns that are all networked. Each town has, half a dozen factories, and they're all kind of out on the outskirts of town. But you have this, and the transportation web, you have a few major highways, but for the most part, you're driving on this web of roads that interlaces all of these small towns, and they're all within, a 30-minute bike ride of each other. And so but within the towns, everything is very walkable. You don't need big suburbs, but you don't have centralization. You don't have, the thing that naturally grabs, like the mega cities. Now, in the Netherlands, you still have Amsterdam, you still have Rotterdam, you still have all the big cities. But through much of the country, much of the economic system in life is in this interlaced network of, small towns. So I was thinking, so really, I think the pitch you would have to make to people is, as you say, it's a political economic one, and not so much a technological. It's like, okay, we do so much a percentage of our business here in this region, but if we were to somewhat decouple ourselves from the region and create sort of a web of we could be, say, 70% independent from even the neighboring states. And we could decouple ourselves, gain a measure of political sovereignty. We would not be dependent on everything. And it may or may not, but there's probably a good chance that our prosperity is going to be roughly what it is now, or maybe if it takes a hit, it's only going to be slightly lower, but overall our quality of life will be better because because these interlaced smaller systems create a bunch of side benefits that, that then occur alongside of it. So I do think, like you said, there is an argument to be made for it, but again, you have to examine it in terms of all of the cost benefits, trade-offs or whatever. And then the question of political sovereignty, like, can we, if it really if push comes to shove, do we have the capacity to wield the violence necessary to protect our nice little corner of, our political sovereignty here? Or can we have a handshake agreement with our neighbors?
It's very difficult to make any changes or reforms to any system, because anytime you make a change, there are unanticipated feedback loops, and
that's what a Lula argues, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So obviously I understand that. I would, so the example I just gave was physical infrastructure. I think there also has to be changes to legal and financial infrastructure as well. Absolutely. So my second example focuses more on legal infrastructure. There are many things we could focus on in our laws, our regulations that encourage standardization. This is especially, by the way, important when we talk about globalization. You mentioned globalization earlier and how complex these systems are. I think we forget that these global systems did not emerge spontaneously. It is a very deliberate, very intentional political project that especially got underway after World War II. And it depends on a complex array of international institutions, non-government organizations. It depends on the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF. You need to have regulatory coordination. You need product standardization. You need eventually to move toward monetary consolidation. This is a very complex political project. So we are in the
loss of political sovereignty that goes with it. And that's the thing, is you lose local political sovereignty in the setting up of the system.
So I would, again, going back to I think the 19th century is interesting, because the 19th century is where the type of system we have now, we were in the system building era in the 19th century in this country. And the types of systems we built, I would allege, all have a certain large scale orientation. They all have this rationalizing principle. So one, I think, really great example that I don't think is talked about enough would be laws concerning corporations. And the corporate form, corporations themselves are really interesting because we just kind of take them for granted. Obviously, over the 19th century into the 20th century, corporations have eventually improved their legal status. They're now recognized as legal persons in their own right, which is strange. I don't necessarily want to go down that route, but it is a very interesting legal development, to say the least. But even when we think about what a corporation is really a system within a system, or a technology within a system. The corporate form is not natural at all. It's very strange to me when libertarians, they promote this idea of like laissez-faire economics. The government shouldn't get overly involved in economic processes, but they largely assume that corporations, as we know them today, would have just emerged spontaneously, or could have ever emerged spontaneously, and that's not true at all.
No,
right,
not at all.
So, not at all. So, obviously, like some form, I shouldn't say obvious, may not be obvious to everyone, but there is a historical analog to corporations that is centuries, even millennia in the making. There's even a medieval analog to the corporate form that was utilized, for example, by the Franciscan monks, and it helps them not be poor and yet keep their vows of poverty. All the thing. I don't want to get into that. It's kind of funny, but going back to ancient Roman law, there was some kind of corporate form. But there are three features of our modern corporations that encourages them especially to take the gargantuan, mega corporate form that they do today. And so what we've achieved, basically three things, and they all have the effect of separating investors from management and control. So the first thing that we've achieved is we've said that when you invest in a corporation, your assets are locked in. You can get someone else to purchase your assets, but you can't simply flee with them. Now, that's a very strange innovation. It had to be fabricated, as it were, out of thin air, and then it needed political backing. It needed to be enforced. So if I establish a political partnership, not a political partnership, if I establish an economic partnership, it's the normal mode is that as a partner, I can remove my assets anytime. And what that does is that tends to keep the scale of the partnership more localized. That's why it's difficult for those companies, those law firms, for example, that have accepted this form. It's difficult there's an arduous process to become a partner because they have to trust you. They have to know you. You have to have proven that you're committed to the law firm to become a partner.
Well, and you have to buy in. So there's a certain financial stake that you have to put in. Yes.
That's right. So it's very unnatural to create this other form where I can invest in the company, but my assets in some sense are locked in. Those assets are always locked in. I can receive a percentage of the profit, obviously, but I can't just take what I've invested when the company's not doing well or whenever it serves my purpose. So that's an interesting legal innovation that needs political enforcement. Second, and the second and third are really related to one another. We've established our modern corporations in such a way where any liabilities that investors incur do not touch the corporations. And then, in reverse, any liabilities the corporations assume does not touch the investors. Now, again, these are strange. They're kind of cool, but they're strange legal innovations that aren't natural, that are not intuitive, that require buy-in from the government to say, yeah, we want to do that. And again, what is the effect? What is the purpose of these legal innovations? They allow corporations to engage in riskier behavior, to grow very large, because now I don't have to worry. I can have thousands of investors and they're motivated to do it because my liabilities don't affect them. And I'm motivated to have you invest because your liabilities don't affect me. So, and you don't have
this much less assessment of downstream costs of stuff as well, too, like environmental costs or whatever, because they're not passed on to the owners are much less concerned that you're messing up the environment because whatever you might be accused of doing, because they don't, it doesn't involve any liability against them.
Right. It's very difficult to what they call pierce the corporate veil. And and hold a corporation, even though they're considered legal persons, to hold them criminally liable, right? Like a lot of their cases are tried in civil court, because you have to have like an explicit email from a CEO, demonstrating that they knew that the corporation was doing this and they didn't care, and that's very, very difficult to prove.
Yeah, just go ahead and poison that whole village. It'll make us $1 billion. It's fine. Right. Yeah, you don't get that. Those emails don't exist.
Right. So that's a legal technology that was also developed, honed, and then protected constitutionally through a series of cases stretching all throughout the 19th century that, again, encouraged not just growth, but a certain kind of growth where it encourages very large scale, very impersonal, very bureaucratized. And now we're in the situation you were describing, where it's like, well, maybe you described this, maybe I just thought you described it, but we're in a situation where some people say mega corporations are more powerful than many states, right? Because they can command more.
And not only that, but they are de facto state entities, so you can enact a policy in government that doesn't require police enforcement, because you can count on the corporations to enforce, like, say, for example, DEI laws. Right? You don't necessarily have to have a strong enforcement mechanism when you have DEI scores and all these other things, where the corporations themselves will do their own enforcement. They'll self-enforce and self-police. And so in a sense, they become an extension of the legal framework of the government, working itself out in the policies of the way that the companies are run.
Right. Right. And so here is an interesting case where we have a system being built. In this case, it's a legal infrastructure. So here we're not talking about material infrastructure, but it's a legal infrastructure that's encouraging. It's encouraging certain kinds of behavior. If you want to make a lot of money, what do you need to do? What will they tell you in every business class? You need to be able to scale, right?
That's right.
They never ask, are there any downsides to scale? No, there aren't any downsides, right?
You scale up to your IP, and then you pass like your initial offering, and then you pass it off onto the investors.
That's right. And that's only because we created, again, systems are games. We created a legal system that makes that a successful set of behavior, right? And so it's not just growth. It's not just productivity. It's a certain kind of growth and productivity.
Well, and even the notion of distributed ownership, because I think I've read a number of different authors that have remarked on the downside effects of distributed ownership. The one example, I think it was Alan Ehrenholtz in his book on communities. And he noted the effect, say, like Inglis Air Conditioning in Ames, Iowa, is when that was family owned by a family that lived in Ames, Iowa. They felt a certain degree of responsibility to the community, to the workers, the employers, everything. Once a company gets to a certain scale and you're beginning to draw investment in from shareholders who live, across the United States and Europe, and the ownership of your company is traded by a third entity on the stock exchange, and you're now beholden to these investors as much or maybe more so even in the community that you're in, when ownership is no longer tied to a place or to people, then they can make us like, why are we making air conditioners in Ames, Iowa? Becomes a very real question. And he's like, well, screw it. We're just going to make them in Mexico because it just brings us back more value for the shareholders. And so you have a whole series of like the, 100-year connection or whatever to a specific community is just boom, poof, gone, because it makes it raises your quarterly report by a certain amount. And these are the disconnects that you get with the distributed ownership that comes just the fact of distributed ownership, even more so than the legal obligations that are reduced or whatever as well too, right? So, you don't have any more, there's no moral responsibility that you have to the employees that, you hired them to do a job. And now are you morally obligated? No, you're morally obligated to the investors that actually own your company, that live halfway around the world. So
that's right. I think that's basically what Charles Murray details, right?
Numerous people have made the word. And who was the gentleman that wrote the betrayal of the elites? Christopher Lasch also, I think, notes this as well too. Right. Yeah. Lasch notes this phenomenon as well too. So yeah, you're right. This idea, like, businesses don't have to be operated at scale, and so you're correct. We created a regulatory environment that encouraged businesses to grow beyond the ability of one owner operator to manage the business on his own.
Right. And so, okay, we could think of it. How do we change it? Well, let's take actions that we remunerated before that allowed you to win, as it were, and let's penalize them now. And that's what tariffs are, right? We're imposing a cost that didn't exist before. And you can understand why people who've been playing that type of game would be very upset when all of a sudden you start penalizing the very actions that you rewarded earlier. And so I understand that. And so I think we can't just think in terms of sticks. We also need to think in terms of carrots. We need to start creating systems that reward a different approach. Because let's be honest, one of Adam Smith's insight is that when you're talking about economic behavior, you can't necessarily depend on the morality of every individual. We're
absolutely not. Money has, Ellul is very clear that money has its own morality, and it sets and technology has its own morality. That's what happens when you lose control of the systems, right? And that's kind of the spot that we're in right now, is that money makes its own morality.
Yeah, my final example, and I don't have as much to say on it because it's really beyond my expertise or understanding. But from what I understand, I've read enough to hear this argument made. Okay, sure. So take it for what it's worth, a grain of salt here. From what I understand, there are laws and regulations that make it very difficult to have regionally based exchanges and financial clearinghouses.
Yes.
Right? And so if you're going to have economic investment and productivity that's more regionally based, there is a financial side of this. And again, I don't understand the details myself, but I have been informed that the existing laws and codes and regulations we have encourage large financial clearinghouses and exchanges, such as we have. And again, not the regionally focused ones. So that would be another example.
Yeah. I have heard the similar argument based on, hey, did you know there was a time when Mississippi was the wealthiest state in the Union? And you're like, and why it isn't today? I think they talk about federal exchanges is really the argument of why. So it was the downstream effect of federalizing the exchanges. And again, like you say, I don't understand all the technology or all of the ins and outs of it and the nuances of it, but just enough to know like, oh, that's a really interesting point. And when you said it again, it sort of brought that back up again, but you're right. So you have to create these regional financial exchanges that then give a certain measure of sovereignty over the economic activity to local areas, as opposed to large national entities, like setting a standardized rate, because you need standardized rates and standardized exchanges and clearinghouses in order to run large interstate businesses. And so the privileging the federal exchange over and against, say, the local regional, Mississippi exchange, necessarily impoverished the businesses of Mississippi and made it very, very, very difficult for them to keep up, even though at one point they were the wealthiest state in the Union.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's right. And again, I think technologies will follow. So going back to Nate's argument, let's come up with better technologies. I do think that has to happen. But for technologies to be interesting and useful, first of all, I think you're going to unleash a lot of innovation in areas that you don't see it at the moment. So I can talk about this on a chalkboard, or I can talk about this in the abstract. But again, until you change the organizing principles, those who know what it looks like in their particular segment of the economy or their specific industry, they know what they need, they know what they want. But there are options that aren't even being explored by those interested in producing new types of technology, because why bother, right? Like,
that's right.
Any new technology I introduce, I'm going to be thinking about its large scale potential. I'm not going to be thinking about coming up with technologies that are useful for a diverse array of consumers and producers in a more complex region, right?
Well, this is one thing that I've talked about with Black Horse, also with Nate and so forth too. And I think, I think even with Jeremy Carl as well too, is that the current system in the way it's designing is privileging certain people and creating roadblocks for other types of people. And this type of regionalization sort of, because in empires, they naturally become, they chew up talent. So there's these big regional megacities pull all of the talent out from the regions, flyover country, because the rewards in these major centers are much, much larger. So again, it's like a pyramid, right? If your pyramids are small, there's still a disparity between top and bottom, but the top of that pyramid is much closer to the bottom. As soon as you scale up and you get a bigger pyramid and you scale up, the top of that pyramid becomes much farther from the bottom of the pyramid. And so each scale that you go up allows that top of the pyramid to draw on a much wider scale of resources, right? So, but there is an argument to be made that this type of regionalization potentially is kind of from both a technological, from a legal, all these other, spiritual, communal, there's a whole range of different aspects to it that we've touched, some of which we've touched on today, that you're almost in kind of like the ultimate startup in many ways is renewing these type of local infrastructure and systems to compete against the megalopolises, the New Yorks, the LAs, the Washingtons of the world, that in a sense, getting young men, innovative, competitive young men to say, we can grow communities that have a different quality of life, and we can do so regionally, and we can make pretty decent money, and then we will be kings in our own domain, so to speak.
Yes.
To me, I think this is kind of this is kind of where the pitch is to young men, is that if you really want to get in on the game at the cutting edge, to me, this is where the cutting edge game is, and where it's going to be, is this kind of parallelism argument for build your own kingdom in a local, in a locality that's in that sense that's already there. Because in some sense, we can kind of conceive of how to do it. We just need men who are willing to pick up and do it.
I agree. And if I could make a final pitch for why I think this is possible, which, remember, that was all I was trying to say, that I think it's possible. I'm not predicting that's going to happen. But my final claim, I'm not an economist by training. I'm a political scientist. So I'm kind of dipping into areas that are somewhat outside my expertise, and I accept that. So if anything I've said in terms of the details is wrong, okay, I'm open to being corrected in that regard. I think the broad strokes of what I'm saying are right. And part of the reason I feel confident about it is because I also have a theological argument for why this has to be possible. So I would, if you'll indulge me in that, I would argue back to Genesis 1 in the creation mandate. And I would compare how God framed the creation mandate with how it was later pursued, 10 chapters later at Babel. So God said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it. And we're told, when we encounter the Babel narrative a few chapters later, we're told that it wasn't that humans didn't want to produce. It wasn't that they didn't want to be fruitful, but they wanted to be fruitful in a different way. They were interested in a large-scale, centralized system. They didn't want to be spread out over the world and create their own economic and political regions. So that tells me God, if God had a certain purpose in mind, if he created us a certain way, we were meant to be productive. We were meant to improve our material standard of living, but not just our material standard of living, in a way that's conducive to all of nature, the environment, and everything else. That tells me there has to be a way to do it. There has to be a way to produce, to be productive, but do so in a way that doesn't necessarily lend itself toward one sprawling monolithic system that promotes purely quantitative growth, that necessarily centralizes economic and political power. And so,
and I think, and this is, I think, one of the things that I often joke about. I think you're absolutely right, Brandon, in this regard. And I often joke with people that, the one thing that we don't think of, like, okay, sort of like America or the global system, are we willing to, from a spiritual level, repent of that, shall we say? Okay, we can see that we've built Babel. Are we willing to, in a sense, humble ourselves and repent of that, and then turn away from that and say, okay, what can we do instead of building, the single global tower to the heavens, and people even looked at it and said, like, shooting rockets off to Mars. are kind of the ultimate statement of a society that's building this massive tower is then to shoot we're going to reach the heavens by firing a rocket up there. And, it's almost in a sense, God will be on Mars and then we can go meet God on Mars, so to speak, or we'll be gods on Mars ourselves. That's kind of so if we're not doing that, then what else are we doing? And how are we building a more humane system that allows us, as you say, to maximize who we are as human beings? And I think that there is something to that.
I think that's such a good and important point. And it needs to be emphasized. So what was it? Van Til, who famously said he defined culture as religion externalized. If we think of culture as what we produce, whether material or non-material, as a result of interactions or single individuals, culture is that which we produce, that which we make of the world. In some ways, it's going to be an externalized form of what we believe, of our highest religious commitments. So it makes sense if we are
the artifact of our belief.
That's right. It's an artifact of our belief. So it makes sense if our highest religious commitments are to ourselves, right? We've made man the God principle, as it were. It would make sense that we're going to resemble a system necessary, even unconsciously. We're going to produce a system politically and economically that has these Babel-like features. And so I do think you're absolutely right. The first step has to be repentance. We have to be interested in fruitfulness and productivity, but in submission to God and in the manner that he has prescribed for us. Now, I also think that it's not enough to do that because as I've tried to emphasize, we're so enmeshed in our current system that in order to change courses, we do need to think about it more deliberately than we would otherwise. I think normally, I was just saying,
it isn't going to happen organically.
Yeah. Normally, I think we would just organically produce whatever it is we believe. Like the stuff we make is just going to reflect what we believe. But now we're in a system where like the technological system, the material artifacts that surround us are encoding a certain way of believing that is saturated into us. We've all absorbed to varying degrees. And so I think now we're at a point where we do need to be more intentional, deliberate than we may have needed to be in the 19th century when these systems were first taking shape.
Well, okay, we could say to people, like, I think for the audience, an organic reordering, this could happen, and it may actually be in the cards. We call it civilizational collapse. Right. These are always bad. Nobody, so that would be the organic option. The other option would be to, and I'm all for organic systems, but you're not going to get to a point where organic systems without a certain degree of intentionality. And so you're playing a devil's game in some sense now with technique, and it's here. In a sense, you have to just simply accept and recognize that, you try to see the downside, the trade-offs as much as the benefits, and try to approach it as you can, and accept that there's going to be downside trade-offs, and then try to manage both of those as best as possible to create. And I think it's very much to, I'm not a reactionary. I don't want to overturn the system. I'm not in the billions must die. And this is why, for me, parallelism, how do we then create and institute parallel systems that can resist the reward, the punishments of the regime, to forge a different way of living that would be non-Babel-like and would allow us a repentance from the current way of doing things to establishing a coherent way of life that maybe even exists within the current empire, but is parallel to it, but in a sense charts a different path, a third way. And that's, I think, a parallel path. And I think that's really where do I have all the answers? No. But I think, the necessity of, more and more of us, every day are coming to the realization that this is really where serious people need to be applying their efforts. And I think this is sort of the best path.
Yes, I think one of the paradoxes of this parallelism project is that initially, at least, And my argument for that would be when you're in Babylon, in order to decentralize, you have to have the king of Babylon or the king of who shows up.
Some magistrate, some lesser magistrate who says, I'm going to take control of my local to make this happen.
Well, you do need the collaboration of lesser so top heavy. You also need the blessing of whoever's at the top. So yeah, you have the emperor or the
that's
or the
actually
king.
Yeah. Almost in a sense where you're making a pitch, like saying, hey, give me political control of Chicago.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the paradox about arguing political federalism, regional economic century is that you almost need to start top down. And that's a blatant contradiction.
I got to think about that a bit.
But it's right. Like you need it to be accepted. You need it to be validated. You even need some efforts to be made allowing changes to physical infrastructure, financial infrastructure.
Yeah.
As the case may be.
Then that you, in a sense, that way, you settle the violence onto other issues.
Yes. So yeah, I think it is appropriate for those who are politics. A lot of people who promote frustrated with that. They say, stop focusing on national politics, focus on the state. It's all about political federalism, which is why I think right now you have lost the capacity politically and economically. You anything regionally based anymore. You
have to make an argument that we need these to do this, or this whole project. This is going to secure the future for us.
That's right. It can't just be top down. Is local regional initiative. But I think the first steps at least have to proceed. Right.
Interesting. I think that's a good, that gets us to good. And I think that gives, thank you for coming out and coming on with me. I think we've been at this. So it's a great discussion. I think we need, this is, I think the edge of where, politics, the implications of it, and the both arguments for it and also the opposite. Been really a good conversation for me.
Great, thanks for having me on.